In this video, we're going to go into detail about how to set up the server applications. There's two. There's one server application that actually takes care of the communication between the host application and whatever server you're going to be mailing on. This is to set the configurations for PowerMTA, and also to set up and also to pull from the host application any lists that are used for a mailing. The second application is the mailing application, which really is just where all of your domains are going to resolve to. This is where the configuration files actually will be written to, so that the mailing application knows how to manage clicks, how to manage unsubscribes, bots, opener images, and all that stuff. So basically that part of the application will manage basically the routing from your domains to the to whatever your creatives are. So in Visual Studio, if you have Visual Studio version of the mailing platform, if you go under wherever you've saved your repository and you go under the WFM Market Manager.server, you'll click on the DripHQ server.solution. And once the solution is loaded, you'll notice there are two MVC projects. One's a web API project, the other is just a strict MVC project that just takes care of the routing for MVC. So the web API project, again, like I said, this is what when you deploy it to your server, this will be a separate application. Currently, the actual port it's running on is 23792. You can change that port. That port is actually configured inside of DripHQ, or whatever the mailing platform, excuse me. The mailing platform inside your server, when you save your server, you'll have these different options. This is the port that the host application will talk to on the server. Now, when the server is actually set up, you have to make sure that the firewall is there's a hole for this, for whatever specific port you're going to use on your system. And I'll show you kind of how to set up the server application once we get to that point. But in Visual Studio, you would deploy it like you would the actual application, but you're going to deploy it to wherever your server is. Same goes for the mailing application. Again, this is the MVC application that handles all of the different routing for the mail platform. This is where when you send out a mailing on a specific domain, this is where it gets resolved to. So on the server, you'll have two applications, one for the server and one for the mailing. Now, currently, the name of the application in IIS is hard-coded inside the server application in order for it to communicate with, in order for it to set up the bindings correctly from the host to the server. When a domain is purchased via Namecheap, what happens is that the binding for that specific domain is actually added to the server, so that the resolution of that domain can happen on the actual server. So, but that actual application name has to be called mailing.driphq.com now. If you have access to the repository, you can make that change, and we can show you how to do that. This video is not going to demonstrate that, but we can definitely demonstrate that to you in a separate call or another video. On the server, when you're actually setting up the applications, like I said, you'll have two applications. This doesn't need to be named server.driphq.com. This can be named whatever you want, as long as it's on a specific port and the main IP of the system. Windows doesn't have the concept of a primary IP address. It basically, all IPs are bound to the NIC or bound to a specific NIC on the system. And currently, the mailing platform only supports one interface. So if you have multiple interfaces on the system, it'll only support the interface that has an external, will only support the any interface that has an external access to the network. Or if really it only accesses one NIC, and it will only access the NIC that is the primary NIC on the system. But again, the IP addresses, the way they're set up, when a host company gives you a server, they typically give you an IP address that you remote desktop into. That IP address is what you'll use to set up inside the host application. You'll tell it what the actual IP address is, and when you first add the server, and that'll be a separate video, but when you add a server, it'll ask you to add a new IP address, and that primary IP address is what it's going to be used to communicate. It could be whatever IP address, as long as it has access, as long as the server has access, as long as the host application has access to that server or that IP address and port that you've set up, then it will work. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the IP address that's been given to you initially by the host company, but as long as it's an IP address that exists on the system and is accessible from the outside. But this, just to know that this IP address does not get mailed on. This is the communication between the host and the server, so you can't actually mail on that IP address. You can, but it's a manual process, and we're not going to illustrate that in this video. So going back to the server, again, you would deploy the server application to whatever the name of the server is, whatever application you've set up to be your server, and it has to be running on a specific port. It can't run on port 80 because port 80 is needed by the actual mailing server, unless you have something set up that's resolving to this specific domain for that server. I wouldn't recommend that. I would just recommend the IP address, because that's not how the system's actually set up to run. You can set up an actual domain if you really want to. It will take some manual effort, but for this case, I would just use the IP address and whatever port that you specify in the host application to communicate with, and that'll have to be set up in the bindings for this specific server. If you notice, there isn't a host name actually set up for this. It's not required, and it's not needed. So this port obviously is what will communicate from the host to the server, and you'll also have to have a firewall rule for that specific port. Again, the mailing.driphq.com site, this is hard-coded in the server application to be able to create the bindings. Eventually, we will have a configuration file that will probably config this whole thing out for you, but right now, since it's somewhat a manual process, this needs to be named mailing.driphq.com. You can, if you have access to the code repository, like I said, we can show you how to rename that, and you can name it whatever you want. But this is initially going to be set up with a port 80 binding to whatever IP address you want. This is just so when you actually view it, if you actually try to browse any one of these, when you browse the actual application, it'll give you a server error. That's because we're not actually routing anything to the index page. Another aspect of the actual server application, if you have an add knowledge account, you can set up the how to use add knowledge on this too. And basically, if inside the web config, this ADK option, if that's set to true, then it'll set up add knowledge. But in order for you to do that, you need to have SQL Express installed on the server. It's not required if you're not using add knowledge. If you don't have an add knowledge account, then you can't actually. It doesn't matter that you have SQL Express. As long as it's set to false, it doesn't use SQL Server to maintain anything. Basically, what happens is, because add knowledge, we're caching all the requests coming in, and then we're pumping those into PowerMTA. We're caching them in SQL Server because it was much faster than using the file system. Obviously, if you have the code repository, you can set it up however you want, and you can make changes to that. But for now, if you want to use add knowledge, this will need to be set to true, and you'll need to make sure that SQL Express is set up. The connection string is already there, already set up for you. SQL Express is the only thing that's needed. You don't need the full-blown version of SQL Server, because it's just, we're not using that much space on it. We're only using like 3 or 4 tables, so it'll actually but you can install the full version if you really wanted to. but it's not required. So if the server application is installed correctly and everything is running, you should be able to get to, there's an API, like a ASP.NET default API page. And this should come up if everything's running correctly. And if you click on API, it should show you all of the calls that can be made to the server, whether they're POST or GETs. When the server is set up from the host, a setting file is created. One thing you will need to do on wherever your website is set up, you need to make sure that under the mailing.driphq.com that there is a folder called files that's created. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. I would make sure that that files is created. Also under server.driphq.com, or basically underneath this websites folder, you also need this support files. It doesn't need to be named support files. It can be named anything you want, but this is where the actual server settings get saved. So this is also in your web config, and if we go back into the web config and we scroll down and we look for support file path, this is the support file path. Basically all this is so that you can, these two areas right here are required, because like this is actually where the offers get written to. So this is basically a copy. This is where all of the information for the mailing that's going to be happening, those specific mailing files get put into this files folder. You can change it to whatever you want. It doesn't have to be these directories, but as long as in the web config files that they're pulling from those specific places. The support files, like I said, this is the only place that needs to be set up for all of your server settings, and those server settings basically are what are propagated from here. When you save changes, it actually gets propagated to the server, and all it is a JSON file that holds any information of how the servers communicate together. These are legacy. A lot of these are legacy. A lot of these are actual legacy settings. These are all in the settings file now, so you can actually view the actual settings if you go to API/reset settings. This will show you basically the JSON that basically this mimics what's on the actual host application. This shows you the host URL, where your IIS sites are set up, the hosting port, so on and so forth. So this is an important aspect to the actual server setup, is that you make sure that the support path is set up, and also that the offers files path is set up, because that's where the hosting system will copy the different files to for your specific mailings. The web config file for the host for the mailing application also needs to know where those support files are and where the offer path is. The host URL is also used, so these three are required. These ones are actually copied, and these are from MVC by default, but these three are required for the mailing application to work.